I wanted to take a look a little further ahead into what's almost certainly going to be the hottest feature of the next World of Warcraft expansion, Midnight, and that's player housing. This is a feature that has the potential to either bring in a ton of fresh players to World of Warcraft, or at the other extreme lead us into a kind of Garrisons 2.0 situation. At this early stage, the feature really could go either way, depending on the decisions that the developers make as they navigate their way from concept through to the finished product. What will decide that outcome will be the answer to a bunch of questions that players have already raised, some of which expose some potential development landmines for Blizzard. These questions, many of which I suspect even the developers haven't yet answered, will no doubt be resolved later this year as we get to test the feature out in the Midnight Alpha and Beta phases. But I think it's still interesting to take a look at those questions right now, and perhaps give you some of my thoughts on how I would like to see them turn out. I've personally been hoping for what I would describe as proper player housing ever since I got my first garrison. While I'm not an RPer, I still do develop quite an emotional attachment to my characters, and seeing them being able to set up home kinda adds a little bit more immersion to that. The garrison never fully worked, of course. Setting up a home in an alternate reality while their characters remain homeless back in Azeroth just doesn't really hit the mark. That appetite was only further whetted by Final Fantasy XIV. I only really play the MSQ in 14, so I've never tried to navigate its severe housing crisis to get an actual house, but I was still able to get an apartment, which is basically a single room house, and those are in quite plentiful supply. Experiencing the depth and flexibility of customization in 14's housing system was a bit of an eye-opener in what is possible. But experiencing the issues with that system, I think, also helps me to see some areas where World of Warcraft has the opportunity to learn and improve. The biggest fear I hear with player housing is that it will end up causing a repeat of Warlords of Draenor, where people just camped in their garrisons, making the rest of the game world feel very empty. I do understand where that fear comes from, but in my view, the real cause of the game feeling empty back then was the lack of stuff to do outside of the garrison. I mean, after the first couple of days, all there really was the Apexis dailies. This, of course, was further exacerbated by what was the most severe content shortage in the game's history, and the introduction of sharding, which arguably continues to this day to make the game world feel far less populated than it really is. In my view, the way to make the game feel more populated is by giving us plenty of reasons to go out into it, and that's entirely independent of any player housing system, with one exception that I will come to. When the team announced their initial plans, which I have to say turned out to be a bit of a surprise to the community, they set out 3 main pillars. The first of those is boundless self-expression, which sets out a vision of a system that is far more flexible than the garrisons just put a fixed thing in a fixed location approach, promising a wide range of decoration options, some of which were shared with us in concept art. The proposed approach very much makes me think of Final Fantasy XIV's system, which, if you haven't experienced it, does allow you to freely place furniture, floor and wall hangings, and even partitions, some of which look like doors and walls, entirely flexibly within a room spaces. But the team also used the phrase "build a house," which has led many of us to speculate that it could go quite a bit further, instead of just giving us a fixed layout house, potentially allowing us to construct the house as we see fit as well. That latter is quite speculative, of course. Build a house could just mean that it's talking about how we set up the interior. The next pillar is deeply social. While the team immediately emphasised that the housing system will fully support solo play, they do plan to include systems to encourage social interaction, and a little more vaguely proposing progressing with friends, neighbours and guilds. It's not really clear what that means. The obvious answer is being able to visit other homes, a core feature of Final Fantasy XIV. But does this also mean that perhaps there will be some shared progress systems, or maybe the ability to contribute to a friend's house? I'm not really sure how I feel about those options. One major element of this, though, is going to be the neighbourhood system. The garrison used an instanced housing approach where everybody had their own garrison, but they all shared the same identical location in the game world, which meant you only ever saw your own. For the new system, the developers are planning to use the instance neighborhood approach, where there will be multiple separate houses existing in a shared instance or shard. This is much more similar to 14's ward system. The good news though is that the team did emphasize that they do plan to ensure that everybody will be able to get a house. So there's effectively going to be unlimited neighborhoods, at least in terms of our ability to find a house. So no need to worry about the Final Fantasy XIV system shortage. The team have also promised that housing is not going to be very hard to get. The big surprise though is that the developers plan to have two types of neighborhoods. Public neighborhoods, which are essentially where your house gets allocated to a shard by the game servers, and private neighborhoods where you'll be able to choose who you share your shard with, be it friends or guildies. This particular feature has proven to be a bit of a game changer, with many people I know who were either skeptics or even anti-housing suddenly becoming a lot more interested in it due to the social potential. Sadly though, it does not seem like we're going to have a lot of choice of where we set up our house. At least for launch, it seems that we can expect to have just two housing areas, one for the Alliance based in Elwyn, Duskwood and Westfall, and one for the Horde based in Durotar and Shara. This is the part of the announcement that did have the most mixed response. While many players recognise that these are pretty safe choices to start with, other players, especially in the Horde side, are concerned about the similarities with the Garrison, where we were basically limited to Stormwind human or orc look-alike architecture. I have seen a fair bit of speculation that these two zones will be quickly followed on by a Silvermoon themed zone, as that's likely to be the main hub for Midnight. There is definitely a good argument that adding a housing zone for the new expansion could make a lot of sense, but the initial update talked about the amount of effort that's required to build new zones, and I have a strong suspicion that building out those two zones will likely stretch the team to the extent where having a third zone in Midnight just won't be an option. And that's something that is a bit of a shame, as Silvermoon could have been pretty awesome theme-wise. The final design goal that I'm not going to dive into here is the promise that this is a long-term feature. This was great to hear, as the World of Warcraft team have a very long history of building out systems for one expansion only to then abandon them. I mean, ever since Burning Crusade, they've been funneling us into new expansion areas, leaving the older world deserted. And it's quite natural for us as players to question if the housing system we will end up getting will be all we'll ever get. This promise of a long-term future, along with a separate announcement from executive producer Holly Longdale that there's now a dedicated housing team that is separate from the other groups in the developer team, does give me a lot of hope that we can though expect to see some more housing zones in future. Most likely though, I will expect to start to see them more in The Last Titan than in Midnight. Now, that's a lot of information to get started, but let's dive into those unanswered questions. The big open question for me is, how do we get a house? We have been promised that it's going to be very accessible, but does that mean a simple side quest where we get one for free, or is it going to be a small amount of gold? And what would a small amount of gold mean in the context of player housing? There's also the question of housing types. Final Fantasy XIV has 3 different sizes of house, along with single room apartments, and even pre-decorated in-rooms. Different sizes of houses are a bit of an MMO player housing staple, so will rich goblins be able to splash out to get a much bigger house? Or perhaps will we be able to grow our house in size and scale as a gameplay progression mechanic? Only time will tell on that, of course. On the subject of choosing a house, there's also the question of location. We know that the Alliance is going to be limited to the Alliance themed zone, and the Horde likewise, but will we be able to choose the specific house plot that we want in the neighbourhood? Or are the servers just going to allocate one to us based on what's available? Obviously, in an established private neighbourhood, the player is going to be slightly limited by which housing plots have not yet been taken, which I suspect could mean that some guild masters would have some fun time trying to mediate between guildies who will all want the best location. But for public neighborhoods, it could be potentially possible for us to get a free choice, or on the other hand, it might well be that the choice could be limited as the neighborhoods fill up and the game tries to make sure the neighborhoods are full before spinning up more. Now, this question really does matter because no matter how hard the developers try to make every plot in the zone equally attractive, humans are very much followers of fashion, and it's virtually inevitable that certain plots are going to be a lot more popular, and most likely there are going to be a bunch of plots that no one's going to want. This means that with a free choice, there's a very high risk of ending up with a large number of shards which are relatively lightly occupied, with even the busiest shards still having a bunch of unoccupied blocks. The only way to avoid that, of course, beyond forcibly moving plots for us, is to create that artificial scarcity, where new shards are only spun up when the existing ones reach, say, 90% occupancy, which means that the chances of you being able to choose where you put your home could very much depend on when you log into the game. And that, of course, raises another problem. If you're one of the unlucky ones who cannot get one of the good plots, how is that going to feel? And could that make some players move heaven and earth to find a way to create a personally private neighborhood to give themselves a bit more control over location? And this does bring me to that question of how we acquire private neighborhoods. It feels like a no-brainer that a guild master could create a guild neighborhood, but the update also talks about groups of friends and perhaps even in-game communities being able to create them too. But how is that going to work? If any player can create a private neighborhood quite easily, I suspect that there's going to be rather a lot of one-person neighborhoods, which is almost certainly not what the developers will want. So it seems like it's possibly very likely that there are going to be restrictions on creating them. The most obvious answer, I think, would be similar to guild signatures, where you'd need maybe 3 or 4 other players in order to create the neighborhood. Then there's the question of how a private neighborhood is going to be managed. Presumably there's going to be a system similar to GMs and officers who have the power to kick, shall we say, the undesirables. But what happens if you got kicked? Do you just get moved to a private neighborhood, or is your home going to be repossessed and forcing you to start afresh? I kind of feel like the neighborhood system could be where most of the potential issues for the new system will arise. For example, with public neighborhoods, the update tells us that they want these neighborhoods to be persistent, which means we're going to have the same neighborhoods potentially for a long time. Well, there's a big but here. Is this going to be permanent? It's very likely, especially if houses are easy to get, that pretty much everyone will end up with a house at the start of midnight. But housing isn't going to be for everyone, and it's almost certainly inevitable that a decent percentage of those houses will be created and then have nothing done with them, meaning that they're always going to be completely empty and abandoned. And on top of that, there will be the usual new expansion increase in players, many of whom will decide that the expansion is not from them and drop off after a month or 2. So will the game have a system to recover for that? For example, will the games try to move more active players together into active neighborhoods and moving the dormant accounts into what you might call dormant neighborhoods? And if they do, will they apply the same system for those players who do have a house, who are active in the game, but never actually visit them? While solutions like that would allow the system to ensure that inactive player housing zones do start to recover over time, you do have to wonder how aggressive the system might be. For example, if you decided to take 3 months off the game, you could potentially come back to a deserted housing zone, which is probably not the kind of experience that the developers would want for a returning player. And of course, if you do have neighbours, that does not guarantee that you're going to like having them. A lot will depend on how flexibly we can change the exteriors. If we can build a house, well, I think it's only a matter of time before somebody figures out how to build a structure that looks like a certain part of anatomy. And even if that's not possible, if we could, for example, place housing items outside, well, you could easily end up with a bit of a dump site for a neighbour. And then, of course, there's a nightmare scenario, which is when your neighbor is that player that you really don't want to have to see in-game every day. I just hope Blizzard's GM team are prepared for the level of contacts that are going to come out of this. Those are, of course, the most extreme examples. Most housing areas will, I'm sure, be quite lovely, but that's no consolation for the minority of players that are going to get the very bad experiences. Another major question for me is how all of this is going to work with warbands. With just 2 housing areas, it seems very likely that we'll be limited to a single house per character. But does that then follow that each character on our account could potentially have a house? Or will it be one shared house per warband? Or maybe you might get one per faction per warband? In the update, Blizzard did use the following phrase: your houses are also shared amongst your warband, which does heavily imply that currently the thinking is that it's going to be at least a house per player. The team's update also did say that as well as being able to visit our friends and guildmate homes, even cross-faction, they also plan for us to be able to live in our friends' homes, or for our warband characters to be able to use another character's house as their own. So what could living in another character's house look like? In Final Fantasy XIV, guild housing does have the option where a guildie can create their own instance room within the guild house. So could that mean that bedroom areas are going to be instanced on a per character basis? Or will it just be that all occupants just need to share the whole thing? Treating a house as your own heavily suggests that we could potentially change the decor or layout of a shared house. But will that be limited to just our warbands? Or could you potentially mess out with a guildie's house if they let you stay in it? I think you could see what could potentially go wrong with that one. And for people in shared neighbourhoods, is it going to be possible to create a public building like a guild hall or community centre? The update does talk about us being able to progress goals as a group, but there really is a huge question over what that would look like. Housing which is purely cosmetic is the safe way to avoid a Warlords of Draenor garrison situation, but it's hard for me to see how a purely cosmetic system could be made appealing for group play. And that leads us to another major question: will housing have any utility at all? The simple answer is that the more utility they have, the greater the risk that the expansion capitals will be emptied out. The main reason that Dornogal has its bustle with other players right now is down to people sitting about in the area as they fill the pub groups or wait for the GMs to call them for their raids. Once we get player housing, there is going to need to be a good reason to convince us to not just do that from home. The more utility that's in the player houses, the less reason there's going to be to leave them. For me, that means that I feel like things like having a bank at home, or even worse, an auction house, could be very problematic. But does that mean we have to have zero utility? Personally, I think that that's quite a likely outcome. Though at the same time, from a purely RPG perspective, it does feel like a mailbox and maybe a transmog station at home could make a lot of sense. So, will we have them? Or won't we? Now, I know this video has had a lot more questions than answers so far. It is very unprecedented for the World of Warcraft developers to share a major expansion feature so far in advance. And as I mentioned at the start, that likely does mean that even the developers do not have all the answers as they're working through the process of building out the feature. But all of these questions, I think, are going to be pretty important in defining whether the feature succeeds or fails. For myself, I do have a little bit of a shopping list. Personally, I'm hoping for one house per character for now, which combined with the easy sharing with the warbands could allow us to have quite a lot of housing in practice. I would also really like to see a much firmer commitment for more zones in future. In my opinion, the choice to start with human versus orc zones kind of feels to me like the dev team are trying to play safe. If I was giving them feedback in this proposal, I would be telling them that they should be trying to stretch themselves to find a way right now to be a bit more ambitious in the scale of their offering. I also do want to see a choice of housing sizes, ideally as a progression system where we could earn the ability to get larger homes in future, and possibly use that as a springboard to break the one house per character rule later as we get more choices of zones. I would also really like to see longer term an option to have a home in the country, which instead of being in a dedicated housing neighbourhood would be set out in the main open world. While dedicated housing zones have a lot of advantages, especially on the social front, it does mean that the housing is going to be somewhat disconnected from the open world. For the warbands, I would want the ability to have per character bedroom spaces. The gold standard for this would be for the largest housing sizes to offer a dedicated room per character that are other characters to visit, and perhaps even see our alts lounging about, going about their business like we do with the garrison followers. That of course would not really be feasible in smaller housing sizes, and for those I suspect we'll probably have to make do with an instance bedroom system. Now, I haven't spoken much about the decor, but I do want the team to hit the ground running here. Furnishing sets having a theme is a really good start, and I'm hoping it'll be fully featured, with as well as chairs and things like rugs and tables, but also fireplaces, cooking ranges, and even beds and baths. I also hope that we'll have a full set themed for every playable race. If we are to be limited to human versus orc buildings, at least for our elves, Draenei and Tauren, it would be nice to have them to be able to build a decoration that would remind those characters of home. But most importantly, I do hope that the team avoid going too far with their desire to make this all a social experience. The private neighbourhoods concept is excellent, enabling guilds and other groups of friends to choose who they live beside. And being able to see the same people out and about is very appealing. But even the most social players sometimes do need some me time. And for me, player housing is a system that has that potential to provide that me time. I don't mind dipping into the social aspects, but I don't want to be forced into them. The WoW dev team have a long and unfortunate history of failed attempts to nudge players into being more social, which just end up crossing the line where it just feels like compulsion. And therefore, if I have one bit of feedback for the developers, it is this. Give us the tools to enable social use of housing, but allow us to choose to use them or not as we see fit. Final Fantasy XIV does a really good job with this. We can choose to open our houses for others to look around and even lay out a guest book for them to sign. A system that has grown over times to, believe it or not, where some people host RP nightclubs in their houses. But that was an entirely organic development. The game gives no rewards for opening their houses to strangers, which clearly demonstrates that you do not need compulsion or even nudges if it's done right. Anyways, that's my current thoughts about the questions and concerns I have with player housing. But what about all of you? Are you excited to have a building of your own in Azeroth? Or do you worry that no matter what Blizzard tries, it's just going to end up being Garrison 2.0? And what do you think Blizzard should do to ensure that those expansion capitals, most likely Silvermoon and Midnight, will remain busy with players? Let me know in the comments down below. If you found this interesting, informative, or even just annoying, then let me know by hitting that like icon. And if you want to support my channel, the best way to do that is to hit that subscribe button before you forget, along with the bell icon if you want to be notified whenever a video of mine goes live. That's all for now. Thanks for watching.